Thank you, Joelle, and thank you to all the members of the Kennedy School Alumni Council in DC for arranging this evening. It's great to be with you. It's great to have this opportunity to meet with my fellow alumni and talk about issues of shared interest. As Joelle said, I'm kind of an alum twice over because I had my 2 years at the Kennedy School in the early 80s, and then another 2 years, at least part-time, as a senior fellow between 2011 and 13. And I keep on going back. It's a sort of this magnetic pull that the school has, and I'm sure if they'll have me, I'll keep going back because I just love it so much. It's also given me the inspiration for a lot of the work that I've done, and I hope to convey some of that in my remarks this evening. You know, I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity to talk about the book because it's not actually a completely new book. Full disclosure, the book was published nearly a year ago. But it was published in November 2016, and as I sometimes observe, the publication of my book was not the most important thing that happened in November 2016, even to me. And there's a sort of a connection in a way there. One of the things that my publisher arranged as part of the sort of book tour that I did when the book was published was to give a talk at the Politics and Prose bookstore here in the district. And that was a big deal for me. I love Politics and Prose. I'm delighted to see there's going to be a second one at the Southwestern Wharf, and I think it's just a wonderful institution. So I spent a lot of time preparing for that evening. It was going to be a Saturday evening later in November, and I went to sort of check it out. And my wife and I went to see other speakers, and particularly we went to up there on the Saturday evening before the election, Saturday, November the 4th. And we didn't know this in advance, but by chance, the speakers that evening were Michael Cranich and Mark Fisher, the authors of Trump Revealed. And they were terrific, they were great, they're Washington Post reporters, they'd done this in-depth exploration of the Trump phenomenon, lots of interesting perspectives, not terribly laudatory of the then candidate Trump. And at the end of this, and I'll never forget it, they said, well, you know, the unfortunate thing about this book, or maybe it's a fortunate thing about this book, is that in 4 days it'll become completely irrelevant and nobody will care about it and it'll be completely forgotten. And of course, all the experts were saying exactly the same thing. The outcome of the election was pretty apparent at that stage, and we all kind of laughed, very relaxed, and looked forward to voting and thought everything's going to be fine. And we all know what happened. And you know, that theme of experts getting it wrong has sort of become really a theme of our times, really. I mean, I think in many ways one of the most important themes of our times. And fortunately, it's sort of what I wrote about. So it seemed timely to sort of reflect upon why experts get it wrong. After all, that wasn't the only election the experts had gotten wrong. In my own home country, I still think of it as home, even though I've lived in the US for 10 years, in my own home country of the UK, both the 2015 and the 2017 general elections, the experts got those wrong. And most importantly, and of course most critically, the Brexit referendum, they got demonstrably wrong. And you can't really blame it on the pollsters, because actually the pollsters were saying it's pretty even, but the experts were very confident of what was going to happen. And then reverting back to this country, it wasn't just the political analysts, the political experts who got it wrong. It's also the Wall Street analysts, the Wall Street experts. After all, you know, what they were saying was Hillary Clinton's going to win, and there'll be a mild uptick in the stock market. A Trump victory is highly unlikely, but if it were to happen, there'd be a Wall Street crash. And I remember that night, you'll all remember, I'm sure, one of the things that did happen was that the futures index collapsed that night. But the next day, changed, and as we know, since the election itself, the Dow Jones index has gone up by more than 25%. So, you know, there's a lot of experts getting it wrong. They don't appear to be ashamed or indeed lack any confidence in predicting the future. But it does make us wonder, why do experts keep getting it wrong? And here's one manifestation of that. I was in New York 2 days after the election, and I thought this headline pretty much told the story. Everyone was wrong, and particularly pundits, polls, politicians, and the press. In our day and age, there are lots of experts. Now, not all of them wear a badge saying, hello, I'm an expert, but there are plenty around, and plenty of people who have spent a lot of time building a profile as an expert. And that really has become almost the manifestation of our time. Now, I think it's important to declare that I'm not sort of antithetical to the concept of expertise. I don't think it is a bad thing to spend time getting to be an expert. One reviewer of my book said, Lovegrove is not some hippy-dippy flower child against the concept of consultants and corporations, and that's definitely not true, as you can tell. I come from that world. I come from the world of, I went to the Kennedy School, as you know, I went to business school, I trained, I spent much of my life in a consulting firm, which is all about expertise, all about models and algorithms. I'm not a futurologist. I never really plied my trade trying to predict what was going to happen, although I was asked many times, particularly about, is the internet going to work, or, will people buy Apple iPhones, or so on. I always said, I haven't got a clue, let's see what happens. But I'm not antithetical to that concept per se. But I am concerned that we have swung too far, and in particular that the pendulum has swung in our society and in all aspects of our society from what I think of as broadly gauged, multidimensional problem solvers to specialist experts, or people who at least define themselves as specialist experts. I've seen that in multiple walks of life. I've seen it in medicine, in government, in education, in law, in accounting, in my own field of management consulting. As Joel said, I was at McKinsey for nearly 30 years. I joined after the Kennedy School, went to business school, came back, spent a long time there. And during that time, the sort of essential value system changed from one extreme to the other. When I started, most people defined themselves as generalists. They were the celebrated people. There were a few specialists, but they were treated almost literally as second-class citizens. They were people you called when you really, really needed some. By the time I left, it was completely the other way around. By that time, pretty much everybody defined themselves as a specialist in some way or another. And those few of us who were clinging on desperately to any notion of generalism were viewed as dinosaurs. And that was sort of very much how we... So I think this is a very, and I think the reason why that's relevant is consulting firms and other professional services firms are really mirrors of the society in which they're operating, because after all, they're all about client service, they're all about meeting a market need, and demonstrably what the market was saying was we want and need specialist experts. Now, why is this? Well, lots of reasons. It's an increasingly complex world, there's so much to know, the bar to expertise is so much higher. But I think if you put it down to one single concept, you might sort of assign it to the 10,000 hours rule, which in many ways encapsulated this concept that you've really got to focus and you've really got to put in the time. Malcolm Gladwell famously observed, quoting Daniel Levitin, that in order to develop true mastery in a given field, to achieve the status of a world-class expert, you have to put in at least 10,000 hours. I think that's undoubtedly true. I mean, it's really hard to argue with. Indeed, I suspect 10,000 hours is something of an underestimate of what it takes to achieve mastery, a word I'll keep coming back to, and certainly to achieve world-class expertise. And as I say, we should absolutely want people to put in that kind of time and commitment to develop that kind of expertise. The way I think of it is, if you get on a plane and the pilot comes on the tannoy and says, delighted you're traveling with us, just have to tell you this is the first time I've actually flown. You'd kind of say, or if you went to hospital to have a heart operation and the surgeon said beforehand, actually, I really only operate on knees, you'd sort of say, well, I think maybe another time. So it's certainly important to have people who have put in the time and who have put in the commitment. But this can be taken too far. Medicine is a good example, actually, I think, of this phenomenon. In our lifetimes, medicine has gone from a sort of a broad-based arena to one of ultra-specialization, one in which yesterday's specialist is now viewed as a generalist. And today's specialist will be viewed out in the future. Tulga Wanda, the surgeon and author, writes brilliantly about this as a surgeon, and he observes his sort of particular quip in his book, The Checklist Manifesto, was if somebody tells you that there is such a thing as a right ear surgeon and a left ear surgeon, you should just check to see whether that's true, because it might be. And maybe it will be at some point in the future. And he's also written eloquently about most recently actually in the New Yorker, about the fact that the healthcare system puts so much value on the so-called heroic intervention of the specialist surgeon, as opposed to the patient incremental care of the family care physician. And he, as a surgeon, acknowledges that oftentimes there is more value in that patient incremental care of the broadly based primary care physician. But that is not what the medical system currently values, whether it be in financial terms or in prestige or anything else. So medicine, in a sense, serves as a symbol of this trend that we've seen. Tremendous progress, wonderful things have happened as a consequence of increased specialization, but we've paid a price as well, and quite literally a price, because of course the other aspect of healthcare has been the growing cost. It would be fine to go down this route of increased specialization, of ultra-specialization, if it was working, if it delivered good outcomes, if it always kept us secure, if it avoided unnecessary risks, if it delivered us into sustained progress and a positive trajectory. But demonstrably, that's not the case. We can cite example after example over the last 10, 20, 30 years where we've gone down that route of ultra-specialization and it's gotten us into trouble. And I think the 2008 financial crisis is the best example of all, when clearly I think all the experts agree, and all of us can see that we lost track of what was going on in our financial institutions, not just in the technical sense, but in almost the ethical and moral sense, lost perspective and lost control. And that's just one of the most important, if you like, of a series of corporate and economic disasters of the last 20 or 30 years, where you can see clearly the footprints of over-specialization, of people with technical capabilities that didn't have a broader perspective on what they were doing. Enron was both a technical and a criminal disaster and catastrophe, both for the company and for its employees and shareholders. The BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, similarly, a catastrophe of allowing specialist experts to govern. And most recently, and this continues, so we shouldn't feel like this is over, Equifax, almost according to the CEO, the now ex-CEO, came down to the failure of one specialist, one person. They had let the company depend upon one specialist to determine their security, or in this case, otherwise. So there's a trail here. There's a trend and a trail of bad things happening when we allow ourselves to become too dependent on specialist experts with insufficient managerial supervision, regulatory supervision, whatever it may be, but insufficient perspective about the implications of what's going on. And the problem about this is we kind of know about the limitations of expertise. It's not a great secret that experts make a lot of mistakes. It's particularly not a secret that they are bad at predicting the future, even, and sometimes especially in their own areas of specialist expertise. Researcher after researcher has analyzed this phenomenon. The most expert person on experts is Philip Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's done countless experiments to show that when you look to experts to predict the future, it's pretty much a 50-50 bet as to whether they get it right or wrong. Dan Gardner said, when it comes to experts, their predictions are pretty much worthless. You can do better. And most famously, Daniel Kahneman, the father of modern behavioral economics, said that when it comes to making predictions about the future, you'd be better off with a quote-unquote dart-throwing monkey than an expert, hence the dart-throwing motif. So there's a lot of research and a lot of understanding that, and I think also an increasingly robust understanding of why that is. And the why is really all about the tendency of experts to coalesce too easily around a consensus, around a shared point of view about what's going to happen, to create that kind of herd instinct. And also to do so with the degree of confidence and almost complacency that expertise tends to provide. After all, when somebody asks an expert their opinion, they don't typically want to hear, well, this could happen or that could happen or maybe this. They want to hear, I can tell you that this is what's going to happen. So that's a volatile mix, because when you say to people, when you imbue with people that degree of confidence and they are part of that herd instinct, then bad things can happen. And I think this is part of a broader phenomenon that we have all, I think, become sensitized to, in part because of the result of the election or the unexpected nature of these election results, not just in this country, but in other countries, and unexpected events of other kinds. This echo chamber effect that we talk and listen to people with whom we already have a tendency to agree. I think it was historian Simon Sharma. I was at a conference with him, and he asked this, I think, quite fundamental question: do we want to live in circumstances where the only people we know are just like us? And I think if we're all of us honest, the answer to that question has been kind of yes. That's pretty much the way we have been living and the way we tend to operate. It's not, by the way, an entirely modern phenomenon. It's to some degree always been true, but it's become particularly pronounced in this arena of expertise, and it has particularly pronounced consequences as we've just explored. And even if this was all fine and the expert system worked and it delivered good outcomes and it was good at predicting the future and it was good at dealing with the consequences, we'd still have a problem. It would still be a difficult concept to sustain for the future of ourselves and our children and future generations, because it does have a tendency to keep getting obsolete, principally but not exclusively because of technology and the impact of technology. It's too simplistic to say today's specialist knowledge is tomorrow's commodity, but I think it is increasingly the case that certainly the bar for expertise keeps rising, and the degree to which technology can render a particular area of expertise obsolete is profound. And that matters in the short term, but it matters even more in the long term, because nowadays we all have to think about our lives and careers in the long term. We have to think about the long view for ourselves and certainly for our children, because primarily because of this phenomenon, which is average life expectancy. I only briefly refer to this in my book, and you'll see the reference to it, but since I published it, I've come to feel it is even more profound in its consequences and implications for our society. And the numbers are startling. Every year, average life expectancy increases by more than 2 months. Today, a 20-year-old today has a 50% chance of living to 100. A baby born today has a 50% chance of living to 105. In my lifetime, average life expectancy has increased by more than 15 years. So these are transformative changes. They change everything, and they certainly change the nature of careers and the nature of how we should be thinking about our careers, and I'll come back to refer more to that. So I think what we need to recognize is that the sort of value system that we've created in our professional environments, in government, in business, in education, in the law, and other environments, is struggling to cope with the fundamental forces at work the world that we're living in, characterized by globalization, technology, sustainability, and by longevity. And we ought to give pause to think about whether there is a better model, a better way of thinking about our lives and careers, and the way of thinking about our institutions and the way of thinking about our society. And that's what I wanted to propose in this book and tonight. And that the concept that I have for that is the concept of the mosaic. I should say I wouldn't stare too closely at this if I were you, since you might get a bit hypnotized by it. Or maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. But I think the concept of the mosaic is complex to look at, but simple to explain. It is that life, personally and professionally, is lived to the fullest as a mosaic of experiences, relationships, sources of insight and experience that we can translate and apply in delivering better outcomes for society. And I want to sort of explore what that means and how it might be applied, and then I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about the implications of that for the Kennedy School community. I've understood since I published the book that this is more of a spiritual and artistic concept than a framework for life. So I've searched over the last year for something a bit simpler and a bit clearer and a bit more straightforward. And fortunately, as a lifetime consultant, I've concluded the answer lies in a 2x2 matrix. And this is a huge relief to me because I've lived my life with 2x2 matrices. And here it is. I think there are two dimensions of this framework that really matter. One is length and the other is breadth. As you'll see, the vertical axis is long-term versus short-term, and the horizontal axis, narrow versus broad. And I think we can think about our lives and those of the people who are influenced by us using this very simple concept of, it's almost this game board of where you're configuring your life now and in the future. Now, the first thing I'd say about this is that at various stages of our lives, any of us can operate effectively in any one of the quadrants of this very simple matrix, and that would be fine. It's quite likely that at various times in our lives, we will be in different quadrants. For instance, if we're in the bottom left-hand quadrant, then we'll be pursuing what I think of as singular mastery. And there's that word mastery again, really adopting the concept that Malcolm Gladwell defined, that we need to capture the spirit of and the pursuit of mastery. A lot of us will spend a lot of our time pursuing that singular mastery. If we pursue that continuously and over a lengthy period of time, we may achieve that notion of sustained mastery, grand mastery almost. And you see this quite a lot. You see people who spend 30, 40 years doing the same thing. In the book, I talk about my gastroenterologist who has been doing colonoscopies for 30 years, 15 a week, 45 weeks a year. And he talks, I think, quite eloquently about the impact of that. This is a highly qualified person, one of the best in his profession. But in order to deliver the service that he is qualified to give, which is a valued service, he does the same thing, 15 times a week, 45 weeks a year for 30 years, and counting. And there are numerous other examples of that. That's sustained mastery, grand mastery, but inherently limited and limiting as a concept. So if you operate exclusively down the left-hand side of this matrix, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a valuable service, but you're also dealing with limits and limiting concept. So a lot of people, particularly in the early stage and the later stages of their careers, will find themselves drawn into the bottom right-hand corner, bottom right-hand quadrant, which you might think of as sort of diffuse mastery. I'm not sure it actually is mastery because it's that area where you're either leveraging mastery you already have into multiple different arenas, or you're just playing. For people in their 20s, increasingly thinking about that long life ahead, That's the Odyssey period. People talk about it as the Odyssey years, when it seems appropriate to experiment and appropriate to explore, if they haven't already committed themselves, as many have, to an area of singular mastery. For others at my stage of career and life, we pursue that bottom right-hand quadrant because that's the way we get to play, in a way. We get to experiment. We get to benefit from our years on the left-hand side. As I said, there's a lot of pressure in the workforce, in the employment arena, if you like, to keep us in the bottom left-hand quadrant. But and sometimes we convey that pressure, that constraint, on our own children as they go into the job market, and education conveys that, and it's sort of very much part of the sort of syndrome, if you like, that many of us are operating in. But as any consultant or ex-consultant will tell you, you never want to be too long in the bottom left-hand quadrant of a 2x2 matrix. That's a bad place to be. You've got to find a way out of the bottom left-hand quadrant. And ultimately, I think success lies in the top right-hand quadrant, in the fourth quadrant, which I'll call serial mastery. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's essentially the concept that we can, over the course of a life and career, and will need to, over the course of a life and a career, develop multiple areas of achievement and multiple areas of success. Some of them may be adjacent to each other, some of them may be quite disconnected from each other, and that, I think, provides the sort of governing thought for how we need to adjust our model of success in society. So what's the implication of all of this for the Kennedy School community? I'm conscious, by the way, that this picture is out of date, and that, in fact, shortly the wonderful new Kennedy School campus will be revealed to the world. But I think the Kennedy School has an important role to play. It certainly played an important role in my own thinking about this, and that period I had as a senior fellow there helped me to understand the kind of pressures and the kind of opportunities that Kennedy School graduates have today, which in this world that I've described of ultra specialization. So I'm very keen to explore how this might influence the direction of the school. And I think it really comes down to this. Graduate schools play this increasingly important role in shaping the professional world in which we live. First of all, many more people go to graduate schools than used to be the case. So for many more people, it is a shaping period of their lives. But for many, it's also the period at which they effectively declare their specialty. They define their specialty. They say, this is what I'm going to do, this is who I am, this is who I'm going to be. And that can be as broad as I'm going to be a government person, or I'm going to be a business person, or I'm going to be a lawyer. But oftentimes it can be much narrower than that. I'm going to be a government person who specializes in environmental policy, or I'm going to be a business person who specializes in tech marketing, or I'm going to be a lawyer who specializes in IP law. And oftentimes that leads to really has lifetime consequences. So it matters a lot how the school and the community of the school, of a graduate school, thinks about its mission and thinks about its objective. If, for instance, the Kennedy School were to think of itself as purely focused on delivering specialist technical capability in specific areas of public policy and public administration, that would be a perfectly legitimate definition of its goals, and arguably was what it was originally set up to do. But I think increasingly there is a sense that it needs to be more than that, and certainly in collaboration with other schools it needs to embrace a fuller, more wide-ranging mission and objective than that implies, and particularly to address the fact that governance, as opposed to government, involves not just administration but also business, the non-profit sector, social action, and other sectors of our society. So I think the Kennedy School community can ask itself with purpose 3 questions, and I'd just like to spend a moment on what those 3 questions are, at least in my own mind. First of all, how can we create more tri-sector athletes? In the article that I left for you, which predated the book, I really tried to explore this concept of tri-sector athletes, but it's important to know that I didn't come up with that idea myself. I actually drew it from the Kennedy School. And actually came from this man, who most of you will recognize as the former dean of the Kennedy School, Joseph Nye. Joe Nye, and I heard that he was thinking about this subject and he talked about this subject, so I actually went to see him when I was doing the research for this book. And he was very generous with his time, and he said, when he was dean, a question that he was frequently asked was, why don't all the graduates of the Kennedy School of Government go into government, at least not immediately? And if he was honest, he'd have to acknowledge a significant proportion of Kennedy School graduates don't go into government, at least immediately, and some never. And his answer was, that's a reasonable concern to have, and it definitely is a concern that government is not sometimes not as an attractive an environment for Kennedy School graduates as we would like it to be, or that they, for some reason, feel like they don't want to pursue that. But to some degree, we can relax as long as they convey a mindset of public value and operate as tri-sector athletes. And he said this: a tri-sector athlete is someone who can engage and collaborate across the private, public, and social sectors. He or she carries a sense of public value between the sectors. They seek to create public value in whatever sector they are working. So I think what he was conveying is that we need as many tri-sector athletes as we possibly can. We need CEOs who are tri-sector athletes. We need NGO leaders who are tri-sector athletes. We need social activists, as well as government leaders. And that does require a degree of mobility between the sectors, but more importantly even than that, it requires a mindset. I set out, inspired by that, to meet as many people as possible who either self-defined themselves as tri-sector athletes, or who I could see reflected that spirit of being a tri-sector athlete. And in the book I talk about a number of them. For instance, my longtime friend Josh Gottbaum exemplifies this concept. I always observe about Josh that by accident rather than by design, he has spent almost exactly half of his career in government and half of his career in business and social enterprise and social action. And I suspect that if he had sort of set out with a kind of formula, that would probably have been a pretty good formula. It just happened that way by virtue of elections and other events. And in the process, he did become an expert. He became an expert in financial restructuring. He became an expert in pensions. He ended his government career, or at least the most recent part of his government career, as the head of the Pensions Benefit Guarantee Corporation, as a world-scale, world-class expert on pensions and the very phenomenon of increased longevity that I was talking about a moment ago. I talk about Nate Fick, a more recent graduate of the Kennedy School, who by the time he had gotten to the Kennedy School had already served in Iraq and Afghanistan as a Marine, having graduated as a classicist from Dartmouth, so you can already see a pattern of eclecticism in his pursuit, and who has since, after his time at the Kennedy School and the Business School, has led a think tank on national security issues and now runs a venture capital funded cybersecurity firm in Arlington. And then perhaps one of the most celebrated of Kennedy School graduates, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, president of Liberia, Nobel Peace Prize winner, clearly revered for her political leadership of a very difficult, in a very difficult environment. Less well known that she spent a significant part of her career in the world of NGOs and of business. She spent time at the World Bank here in Washington, at UNDP, at Citibank, and at the Equator Bank as part of HSBC. So a good part of her experience, coming up particularly through her financial expertise, came from her time in the business sector. And there are many other stories that I try to tell in the book about people who've taken that kind of eclectic approach to building their careers, who've taken unusual paths and built upon areas of expertise and applied them elsewhere. People like Paul Farmer, who is and was an eminent physician and specialist in epidemiology, but in part of his time built an extraordinary practice in Haiti, dealing with public health care on that island, and has built from that one of the world's largest public health social enterprises, Partners in Health, which now shapes public health policy around the world. Or his first partner, Jim Kim, who after years of developing Partners in Health together went in a very different direction, first of all into the World Health Organization, then to Dartmouth, and now to most recently here to the World Bank. Or Carol Browner, who's pursued environmental policy activism in all three sectors of the economy, as a social activist and lawyer, as a business person, and in government with the EPA, and most recently as Energy and Environment Sire. Or Patty Stonecipher, one of the first senior women executives at Microsoft, who then led the Gates Foundation and then the Smithsonian Institution, and now a much smaller non-profit, Malthus Table, again in this area. These are people who've made unusual, eclectic choices and have built remarkable careers as a result. They've embodied the Mosaic Principle. I think my absolute favorite is Justin Welby. Justin Welby spent the first 11 years of his career as an oil industry executive in France and North Africa, whilst working in his spare time in his local church. But then in his 30s, he switched over to become a priest, and within 15 years, he was the head of the Church of England and the Anglican Church as Archbishop of Canterbury. So this is the first time for a long time that somebody with a business background is now running a church, and a significant one at that. So I spent a lot of time trying to understand these people, trying to understand how they work, what matters to them, and I concluded there were 6 dimensions of their lives that we should all understand and spend time trying to explore. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through each one tonight. It's in the book. But I think to some degree the important thing about it is that building this kind of life and career is hard to do, but it is doable, and it requires a set of coping skills, a set of disciplines, which are learnable and, importantly, teachable. So you can imagine a curriculum for, say, the Kennedy School, or for parts of the Kennedy School, that embrace this concept, this mosaic concept, and these 6 dimensions. As will have been apparent from the people I talked about, many of them had an intellectual thread that ran through their work. Josh's work on pensions, Paul Farmer's work on public health, Nate Fick's work on national security, but they applied it across a broader spectrum than most people. They have transferable skills. They have a body of skills that they can move from one arena to another, from business skills into government skills into business, and so on. They were able to adapt to different environments because of their contextual intelligence, their ability to interpret and understand what's different and what's similar to each different context. They built networks. They built extended networks. They did not allow themselves to get trapped more than necessary in that echo chamber effect of the only people I know are the people like me. They went beyond that to find people who were not like them. They had a prepared mind, a willingness to accept the challenge of diversity and breadth in building their careers. And importantly, they had a strong moral compass because they understood that they were going to face ethical and other kinds of conflicts of interest, and they needed to be prepared for that, have clear purpose and a clear sense of mission. The second question I think that the Kennedy School community needs to ask itself is, how can we strengthen tri-sector collaborative governance? If we've got people who have a tri-sector mindset, then we're more likely to get this concept of collaborative governance between the sectors to be effective. And that's going to be so important because so many of the challenges that we face today are multidimensional, multi-sector, tri-sector challenges. It's implausible to imagine that government alone is going to solve the problems of climate change or healthcare access or poverty or whatever it may be. These problems are going to be solved by multiple different dimensions of our society. And again, I think the Kennedy School has led the way in thinking about this. These 2 professors, Jack Donoghue and Richard Zeckhauser, have written, I think, eloquently on the topic of collaborative governance, and have explored the degree to which the accomplishment of many and perhaps most important public missions in the 21st century depends not just on government, but on private for-profit and non-profit organizations. That collaborative governance can be a force multiplier, an approach uniquely suited to the market-friendly, bureaucracy-wary United States. Well, would that were the case, and if it is, then it gives us a better prospect of addressing our most important challenges. And then finally, how can we facilitate tri-sector career transitions? In the world in which I've just been talking, in that world of greater, longer careers, there'll be many more transitions. There'll be many more ways in which people need to extend their lives and their careers. There's a wonderful book by two London Business School professors called The 100-Year Life. And it makes the following observations about what a 100-year life is going to be like. First of all, you're going to be working into your 70s or even into your 80s. Many people, myself included, will welcome that, but it's certainly challenging to think about how you're going to extend your working life without getting tired or burnt out or bored. There'll be new jobs and skills, and you'll need to relearn. That's going to be one of the things that is energizing, because there's going to be no way in which you can just keep doing the same thing forever. Life will become multi-stage. We'll move away from the three-stage life of childhood, work, and retirement to a multi-stage life that has many more transitions. And indeed, those transitions themselves will put the emphasis on what I call transformational assets, what they call transformational assets, which is really having an understanding of yourself, of your capabilities, and of your willingness to embrace new challenges. And this concept that they explore of recreation really will become recreation. It'll be in those periods that we're outside of the day job, as it were, when we'll recreate ourselves and create new sets of opportunities that we can pursue. And we'll need to understand that in the midst of all of that, we have to find a good framework for the revolving door. The revolving door issue, the concern about the revolving door is as old as the Republic and many republics before that. The founding fathers struggled with this. Alexander Hamilton was frequently criticized for having too much dependence on his private sector interests, and countless leaders, now revered leaders of this country and others, have been frequently criticized for that phenomenon. And clearly the risks are high, and we see it every day around us. But it's a necessary and critical component, particularly of this governance system, and arguably of all government systems, to be able to embrace people from different backgrounds and different capabilities, and to do so in a way that's ethically robust and sound. And that's going to be a continuing challenge for the Kennedy School and other communities to explore. You know, I guess our world changed when 1.6 million people came to the mall in January. It's clearly this. Talking about this now is, you know, trying to penetrate the level of anxiety and, to some degree, confusion we all feel about this particular era we're going through is tricky. This all feels fine, but then you say, well, what about this world that we're currently wrestling with? And I'd be very interested in your own reflections on that, and you know, I continue to try to reflect upon what it all means. I think I'd say a couple of things about this particular environment, this particular period we're going through. First of all, it's never going to be more important to have tri-sector athletes who are able to relate to the challenges of government and the business sector and the non-profit sector, and indeed, arguably, many of the most important needs right now are going to be in the business and non-profit sector as they try to pursue, for instance, environmental policies that the administration as such may turn against. I'd also add that the mindset of career civil servants has never been more important, because they are, you know, in a sense, what's keeping it all afloat. And that's true at federal, state, and local level. And their mindset and their approach to the people with whom they collaborate is going to be particularly important. And then I go back to the observation about life expectancy. We're going to live a long time, hopefully, many of us, and we'll get more at-bats. And it's going to be important to be ready for those. I think it was David Brooks in his column on Friday who said even the biggest fires create the condition for new growth, and I hope that that's the case as we go forward. And I'm reminded that, you know, they say there's a Donald Trump tweet about everything, which there pretty much is. There's also, fortunately, a John F. Kennedy quote about almost anything, And this one, I think, is a good place to end. It's not enough for a great nation to have added more years to life. Our objective must also be to add more life to those years. Thank you very much.